It was one of those quiet afternoons when the air felt still, and the sound of birds made the whole street seem peaceful. The park was nearly empty, just a few people walking their dogs and a couple of children playing near the fountain. In the far corner, under a tall oak tree, an elderly man slowly made his way toward a wooden bench. He moved with care, holding a small worn-out book in his hand. The book looked old, its cover faded from years of reading. He lowered himself onto the bench, sighed softly, and opened the book. For a moment, he simply sat there, breathing in the calmness. Reading in that park had become part of his daily routine. He had been doing it for years. Some people in the neighborhood knew him by sight, though not by name. He didn't talk much, but he always smiled politely whenever someone passed by. He turned the first page and began reading aloud in a low, warm voice. The words flowed gently, like music only he understood. Sometimes he would pause, close his eyes, and repeat a line as if it meant something deeper to him. To him, reading wasn't just about the story. It was a way to connect with his past, with memories of the people and moments that had shaped his life. The man had always loved books. He had been a teacher for most of his life, helping children learn how to read. Long after retirement, he continued tutoring kids from his community, giving his time for free. But after his health started to slow him down, the park became his classroom, his little escape. He liked the sound of the leaves, the feeling of the sun on his back, and the company of the trees that never judged or questioned him. On that particular afternoon, everything felt normal at first. A few joggers passed by, nodding politely. A woman walking her dog smiled faintly as she crossed the path. A gardener trimmed the bushes near the entrance. It was a good day, calm, bright, and ordinary, but not everyone saw it that way. From across the street, a woman sitting on her porch watched the old man with a puzzled expression. She hadn't seen him before, or maybe she had but never paid attention. Something about seeing him sitting there alone made her uneasy. She couldn't explain why. Maybe it was his presence in a part of town where unfamiliar faces rarely appeared. Maybe it was the way he spoke softly to himself as he read. Whatever it was, she didn't like the feeling. She went inside her house, looked out again through the window, and then picked up her phone. Her voice was calm but slightly nervous when she spoke to the dispatcher. She said there was an elderly man acting strange near the park, sitting there for a long time and talking to himself. The dispatcher asked if the man was doing anything wrong. She hesitated, then said, "I don't know, but it seems suspicious." The call was short. The dispatcher thanked her and promised to send someone to check things out. Back in the park, the old man remained unaware of what was coming. He kept reading, lost in his world. The book in his hands was one of his favorites, a collection of short stories he'd owned since his college days. The corners were bent, and the pages were covered with small notes written in pencil. He smiled to himself as he turned each page. Every sentence reminded him of his younger days, the time when he used to read to his students who listened with wide eyes and open hearts. The sun dipped lower, spreading golden light across the grass. He shifted slightly, adjusted his glasses, and looked around. He liked how the park looked during this hour. Everything glowed softly as if wrapped in warmth. He noticed a few kids chasing each other near the fountain. Their laughter echoed faintly, reminding him of the joy he once saw every day in his classroom. A squirrel ran past his feet, startling him for a moment. He chuckled quietly and returned to his book. He didn't notice the black and white police car slowly turning onto the street near the park. 2 officers sat inside, talking casually. The call they had received sounded harmless, just a report about someone suspicious sitting near a park. They weren't expecting trouble. But as they spotted the elderly man, one of them frowned slightly. They parked near the curb and stepped out. The old man didn't notice them at first. He was too focused on the story. The officers walked closer, their radios crackling softly. The sound made him look up. He blinked a few times, confused but polite. "Good afternoon, sir," one of the officers said. "Can we talk to you for a moment?" The man nodded and smiled faintly. "Of course," he said. His voice was calm, respectful. The officer glanced at his notepad. "We got a call about someone sitting here for a while. Mind telling us what you're doing?" The man lifted his book slightly and said, "I'm reading." The second officer asked, "Do you live around here?" "Yes," he said. "Just a few streets over. I come here most afternoons. I like the quiet." The first officer looked at him, then at the bench, then back at his partner. "Do you have any identification on you, sir?" The old man hesitated for a second, surprised by the question. "Identification? I didn't think I'd need it to read in the park," he said with a small smile, trying to lighten the moment. But the officers didn't smile back. "It's just procedure," one of them said. "Can we see some ID?" He reached into his coat pocket slowly, pulled out a small wallet and handed it to the officer. The officer checked the ID, then stepped aside to speak quietly with his partner. The man sat there quietly, unsure what to think. People nearby started to notice what was happening. A few joggers slowed down. A couple walking their dog whispered to each other. The air around the park began to change. The peaceful feeling from earlier faded, replaced by a quiet tension that no one could quite explain. The second officer returned and handed the ID back. "Everything looks fine," he said. "But we'd like to ask you not to stay here too long." The man looked confused. "Not stay here? Why?" "People have been complaining," the officer replied. "It's a private neighborhood and some residents don't feel comfortable." The old man's expression softened with disbelief. "I've been sitting here for years," he said quietly. "I've never bothered anyone. I just come to read. That's all." The officer's tone stayed firm. "We're just asking you to move along. It's not personal." He closed his book slowly, holding it against his chest. He looked around the park, the same park where he had read countless times before, the same bench that felt like his little piece of peace. Everything suddenly felt unfamiliar. "I understand," he said softly, "but I don't see how reading a book here can bother anyone." The first officer sighed. "Sir, please don't make this difficult." A woman nearby who had been walking her child stopped and watched. She frowned at the sight of two uniformed officers speaking sternly to an old man who was doing nothing wrong. She took out her phone and started recording quietly. The old man stood up slowly, his hands trembling slightly. "I'm not trying to cause trouble," he said. "I'll go if you want me to. I just didn't expect this." He picked up his walking cane and tucked the book under his arm. His voice was soft, almost sad. The officer stepped aside as he walked away from the bench, his back slightly bent, moving slowly down the path. As he left, a small group of people who had gathered nearby murmured among themselves. Someone whispered, "That didn't seem right." Another person said, "He wasn't doing anything." The woman who had been recording kept her camera steady, following the man as he walked toward the gate. Her voice could be heard quietly on the video. All he did was read a book. The old man didn't look back. He kept walking, one slow step at a time, until he reached the end of the park. The book in his hand felt heavier now, not because of its pages, but because of what had just happened. That night, the video spread across a few local social media pages. People started sharing it, adding comments, asking questions. Some didn't believe what they saw. Others felt anger rise in their chests. The old man sat at home by his window, the same book resting beside him. He didn't go back to the park the next day. He wasn't angry, just tired. He had spent his life believing that kindness and patience could change hearts. But now, for the first time, he wondered if the world had changed more than he realized. He looked at the empty street outside, quiet and calm as always. He whispered a few words from the book, then closed it gently. Tomorrow, he told himself, he might go back. Or maybe not. He didn't know that the short moment captured on that phone would soon reach far beyond his small town. He didn't know that his calm silence in the face of unfairness would speak louder than any words. He only knew that he had loved to read. And that day, someone saw danger in it. The evening after the park incident, the video began to spread quietly online. It started on a small neighborhood forum, where someone uploaded the short clip of the old man being questioned by the police. The caption read, "This man was just reading in the park. Why did this happen?" Within hours, it was shared dozens of times. By morning, hundreds of people had seen it. Some thought it was just another misunderstanding, but most couldn't believe what they were watching. In the video, the old man's calm voice could be heard saying, "I'm just reading," while two uniformed officers stood over him. The sight of his frail hands holding that old book made people angry and sad at the same time. It didn't look like a man causing trouble. It looked like someone being treated unfairly for no reason. Meanwhile, the woman who had called the police went about her day as if nothing unusual had happened. To her, it was a simple call. She thought she was just keeping the neighborhood safe. She didn't realize how that one phone call had changed everything. The next morning, local residents started talking. At the bakery, at the coffee shop, in front of the post office, everyone had an opinion. Some said the police had gone too far. Others tried to defend them, saying they were just doing their job. But the one thing everyone agreed on was that the old man hadn't done anything wrong. He had always been seen as a quiet presence in the area. Some remembered him walking with a small bag of books, sometimes reading on a bench near the fountain. A few neighbors recalled seeing him help children learn to spell simple words years ago. He wasn't a stranger, really, just someone most people had never taken the time to know. At home, the old man didn't even know how widely the video had spread. He didn't use social media much. He still had an old phone that only made calls and sent simple messages. When his neighbor came by the next morning to check on him, she told him gently, "People are talking about what happened at the park." He looked surprised. "Talking about me?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "Yes, someone recorded it. It's all over the internet now." He didn't know how to feel about that. He wasn't the type to want attention. All he had wanted was a quiet place to read. But now his simple act had turned into something much bigger. As the day went on, the video reached local reporters. One of them, curious about the story, visited the park to see where it happened. He spoke to a few people who had been there that afternoon. The jogger told him it didn't make sense. He was just sitting there reading. "I thought the police would leave him alone, but they kept questioning him." Another woman, the one who filmed it, said, "I couldn't just walk away. It didn't feel right. He looked so harmless, like someone's grandfather. I had to record it." The reporter listened carefully, then went to the police station to ask for a comment. The officer on duty said, "We received a call from a concerned resident about a suspicious person in the park." The officers followed procedure. That was all he would say. By the next morning, the video had thousands of views. People started leaving comments under it, some angry, some heartbroken. One person wrote, "This is why people lose trust in the system." Another said, "Imagine being treated like this just for sitting outside." The old man's quiet life had suddenly become the center of public attention. His phone began ringing more often. Neighbors he hadn't spoken to in years called to check on him. A local community leader stopped by and offered to help if he wanted to file a complaint. But the man just shook his head. "I don't want trouble," he said softly. "I just want peace." He tried to go about his day as usual. He made tea, watered his plants, and opened the same book he had been reading at the park. But every time he reached the page where he had left off, his mind went back to that moment. The sound of the police radios, the way people stared, the confusion he felt as they asked him to leave. It wasn't just about embarrassment. It was the feeling of being seen as a problem when he had done nothing wrong. That feeling stayed with him. A few days later, local news stations began covering the story. A young reporter came to his door with a camera crew, asking politely if he would share his side. At first, he hesitated. He wasn't used to cameras or interviews, but the reporter spoke gently and promised to keep his story respectful. He agreed, though reluctantly. Sitting on his porch, he spoke quietly into the microphone. "I go to that park almost every day," he said. "It's a nice place to read. I don't talk much, I don't bother anyone. I just enjoy the peace and the sound of the wind." When asked how he felt about the incident, he paused for a long time. His eyes looked distant, tired. "I was hurt," he said finally. "Not because they talked to me, but because they didn't see me as a person. Just someone to question." His words were simple, but they carried weight. When the interview aired that night, it touched people deeply. Viewers saw not anger or bitterness, but quiet dignity. The story spread even more after that. Soon, community groups began speaking out. Some called for an apology from the police department. Others organized a peaceful gathering at the park, inviting people to bring books and read together in solidarity. The idea spread fast. On a sunny afternoon that weekend, dozens of people showed up. Men, women, children, people from different backgrounds all came to the same park where the man used to sit alone. Many of them brought chairs, blankets, and books. Some read aloud, some read silently. A few held small signs that said, "Reading is not a crime." The old man watched from a distance at first. He had been invited, but he wasn't sure if he should go. Then he saw the crowd sitting under the same oak tree where he used to sit, and something inside him softened. Slowly, he made his way across the grass, book in hand. When people saw him, they stood and clapped quietly. He wasn't expecting that. He smiled shyly, his eyes glistening. A young boy ran up and asked what book he was reading. The man showed him the cover and said, "It's an old story about kindness and courage." The boy grinned and said, "Can you read some of it to us?" He hesitated for a moment, but then he opened the book and began reading. His voice was gentle, steady, carrying through the park. The crowd grew silent. Even the children stopped fidgeting. The sound of his voice filled the air, calm, sincere, full of wisdom and warmth. For a few minutes, everything felt right again. The tension of the past few days faded. The park, once a place of confrontation, had turned into a place of healing. After he finished reading, people came to thank him. Some hugged him. Others simply nodded, moved by his calm spirit. The woman who had filmed the incident walked up to him quietly. "I'm sorry you went through that," she said. "I just wanted people to see the truth." He smiled kindly and said, "Sometimes the truth needs help being seen." By the end of the day, photos from the event were all over social media. People called it the reading gathering. News outlets covered it, showing clips of the man reading and the crowd listening in silence. It wasn't just a story about one person anymore. It had become a symbol of how small acts of humanity can bring people together. Back at home that evening, the old man placed his book on the table and looked out the window. He could still hear echoes of the applause, the laughter of children, the sound of pages turning. It felt good to know that something good had come from something painful, but deep down he still wished it hadn't happened at all. He never wanted attention or sympathy. He only wanted to read in peace. That night, as he got ready for bed, he thought about returning to the park the next day. Part of him felt nervous, but another part felt hopeful. Maybe things would be different now. Maybe people would see him differently. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know that while he slept, the story was already being shared on national news channels. More people were watching the video. More voices were speaking up. And even the police department was starting to feel the pressure. For the first time in a long while, his quiet life had become part of something much larger. A conversation that was spreading far beyond his small neighborhood. And though he didn't plan it, the man who only wanted to read had started something that was beginning to open people's eyes. The morning after the reading event, the park was quieter than usual. The air still carried traces of what had happened the day before, the laughter, the applause, the shared hope that maybe something was changing. But beneath that hope, there was still tension. The police department hadn't said much. There was no apology, no explanation beyond the same short statement about responding to a call. People were waiting for answers. News channels kept showing the video of the elderly man sitting on the bench surrounded by officers. Commentators debated whether it was racial bias or just poor judgment. On social media, people were furious. Some demanded that the officers be punished. Others asked how a peaceful man could be treated that way in broad daylight without anyone stepping in sooner. For the old man, all the attention felt strange. He had lived most of his life quietly, unnoticed by most of the world. Now strangers were talking about him everywhere. Some were calling him a symbol of dignity. Others said he represented something deeper, how ordinary people could face unfair treatment even when doing nothing wrong. He didn't feel like a symbol. He felt like a man who had simply wanted to read in peace. That morning, he tried to return to his normal routine. He made tea, folded his blanket, and sat by the window with his book. But when he looked at the park across the street, something in him hesitated. It was the same place he had always loved, yet it didn't feel the same anymore. The memory of the officers standing over him still lingered in his mind. The sharp tone, the coldness in their eyes. He wasn't angry, but he was deeply tired. A knock on the door broke his thoughts. When he opened it, a local community organizer stood there with a warm smile. She had been one of the people at the reading event the day before. She thanked him for his courage and told him that people were planning to meet again, this time not just to read but to demand justice. He listened quietly as she spoke. He appreciated her kindness, but he wasn't sure if he wanted to be part of anything public. "I'm just one person," he said softly. "I don't need attention. I just want peace." The woman nodded gently. "I understand," she said. "But sometimes peace needs a voice." Later that day, another video surfaced, one that no one had seen before. It was a longer version of the original recording from the park. It showed the officers asking the man to leave, and then, after he refused politely, one of them reaching for his arm. The man tried to explain again that he wasn't causing any harm, but his voice was shaky. The officer grabbed his wrist, trying to move him. He stumbled slightly, losing his balance, and dropped his book. It fell open on the ground, pages fluttering in the breeze. The sound of people gasping could be heard in the background. Someone shouted, "He didn't do anything." Then came the moment that would send shockwaves through the community. The sight of the old man being handcuffed while trying to steady himself. The video ended there, but it was enough. Within hours it went viral. People around the country saw it. TV anchors replayed it over and over, their voices filled with disbelief. Hashtags flooded social media calling for accountability. At the police station, reporters crowded outside the entrance. The department released a short statement saying that the man had been temporarily detained for refusing to comply with officers' requests. They insisted that no harm was intended, but the words did little to calm the outrage. The old man, sitting quietly in his small living room, saw the news replay his image over and over. It didn't feel real. He remembered the sound of the cuffs, the way the cold metal bit into his wrists. He remembered the confusion in the crowd, the feeling of being small in a world that suddenly seemed too big. He wasn't violent. He wasn't disrespectful. He had simply asked, "Why can't I sit and read here?" After his release that day, no one from the department had come to check on him. No apology, no explanation, just silence. As the story spread, more people came forward. One woman said she had seen the same officers treat another person harshly a few months before. A man who lived nearby said he had often noticed how quickly the police responded when someone didn't look like they belonged. The discussion was no longer about one man and his book. It had become about how people were seen, judged, and treated differently based on assumptions. Community meetings were organized. Local leaders demanded an investigation. News vans parked near the park for days. The mayor's office released a statement promising to review police conduct, but the pressure kept building. Through it all, the elderly man stayed mostly silent. He didn't give more interviews. He didn't attend the protests. He stayed home reading quietly, as if trying to hold on to the one thing that still brought him peace. But inside he was shaken. The world he thought he knew, the one where kindness and respect still mattered, suddenly felt uncertain. One afternoon, a letter arrived in his mailbox. It was from a young boy who had been at the reading event. The note was written in careful handwriting. "You remind me of my grandfather. I hope you're okay. Thank you for reading to us." The man read the note several times. It brought tears to his eyes, not because it made him sad, but because it reminded him that good hearts still existed. The following week, the protests grew larger. People carried signs with his picture, him sitting on the park bench with his book. Some read, "Justice for the reader." Others said, "Respect our elders." The image had become a quiet symbol of dignity. Reporters tried again to get him to speak, but he declined. "The world has enough noise," he told one of them. "Sometimes silence says more." Still others spoke for him. A former student of his reached out and shared memories of how he used to stay late after class to help children who struggled to read. "He never gave up on anyone," the student said on a local news channel. "He taught me that words can change how we see the world." That interview touched people deeply. It reminded everyone that behind the viral clip was a man who had spent his life teaching kindness and patience. As the pressure on the police department increased, the officers involved were placed on temporary leave. The chief called for an internal review. But for many, it wasn't enough. People wanted accountability. Meanwhile, messages of support poured in from across the country. Letters, small gifts, books, and drawings arrived at his doorstep. He was overwhelmed. Some messages came from children who said they now wanted to read in the park too. Others came from teachers thanking him for reminding the world that learning and peace should never be questioned. One evening, after reading through a pile of letters, he went out for a short walk. The air was cool and the streets were quiet. He passed by the park but didn't go in. He stood at the gate looking at the bench under the oak tree. For a moment he imagined himself sitting there again, reading like he used to, with no one watching or judging. But he couldn't do it. Not yet. The memory was too fresh. The sound of the handcuffs, the voices of the officers, the look of concern on people's faces, all of it still echoed in his mind. As he turned to go back home, a young man walking his dog stopped and said softly, "Sir, I saw your video. I'm sorry for what happened." You didn't deserve that. The old man smiled faintly. Thank you, he said. Maybe one day things will be better. When he got home, he sat down and opened his book again. It was the same one that had fallen to the ground during his arrest. A few pages were bent, but it was still intact. He smoothed the paper gently with his fingers and began to read aloud, just like before. His voice trembled at first, but then grew steady. Outside, the night was calm. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear faint sounds of people gathered, still demanding answers. He didn't need to be there to know that something was happening, that people were starting to see what he had experienced, not as a single moment, but as part of a much larger truth. For the first time since the incident, he felt a quiet sense of peace, not because justice had been served, but because he realized his story had given others the courage to speak. He didn't know what would come next. Maybe the world wouldn't change overnight, maybe tomorrow would look just like today, but deep down he believed that small acts, the kind that came from compassion, not anger, could start to heal the cracks in people's hearts. He turned another page and kept reading, his voice blending softly with the sound of the wind outside. And though the world was still restless for that one quiet moment, he found comfort in the same place it had all begun, in the simple act of reading. The days after the arrest felt long and heavy for everyone involved. The story had spread far beyond the small neighborhood now. News channels from other cities were running reports about the elderly reader incident. Some called it an example of discrimination, others called it a lesson in misunderstanding. But to the old man, it wasn't about headlines. It was about what it meant to be seen, or rather not seen, for who you truly are. He woke up each morning to find envelopes slipped under his door. Some had kind messages, others had short letters from strangers saying they stood with him. A few even sent books, wrapped in paper with notes like, "Keep reading. You inspire us." He appreciated every gesture, though it still puzzled him how a simple moment in a park had become a topic for the whole country. The mayor's office finally spoke publicly about the case. In a press conference, the mayor said the city would conduct an independent investigation into the incident. He promised that the truth would come out and that fair action would be taken. The cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, but behind all the formal words, people wondered if anything would really change. Meanwhile, the old man kept to himself. He tried going for short walks early in the morning before anyone else was outside. He missed the peace of the park, the smell of the grass, the sound of the wind moving through the trees, but he still couldn't bring himself to sit on that same bench again. It wasn't just fear. It was the feeling of being unwelcome in a place that had once felt like home. Across town, the investigation had begun. A small team of officials reviewed the footage, interviewed the officers, and collected witness statements. What they found was simple but painful. The man had done nothing wrong. There was no reason for him to have been stopped, questioned, or handcuffed. The only thing that had made him seem suspicious was that he looked different from the people who usually sat in that park. When the findings were made public, the city's residents were divided. Some defended the police, saying they had followed procedure. Others said procedure itself was the problem. If following the rules means humiliating an innocent man, one protester said on television, then maybe the rules need to change. The department tried to calm the situation by announcing new training programs about community relations and bias awareness. But for many people, that wasn't enough. They wanted a real apology, not just from the department, but from the officers who had arrested him. The old man hadn't asked for any of this. He didn't want revenge, and he didn't want fame. He simply wanted to go back to his quiet life. But every day, people showed up at his door, reporters, activists, even students who wanted to hear his story. One evening, a group of college students visited him with flowers and a handmade banner that read, "Thank you for standing tall." He invited them in for tea, and they spent hours listening to him talk about books, teaching, and life. He told them about his years as a teacher, how he had taught children to see reading as a way of understanding the world. "When you read," he said softly, "you learn to step into someone else's shoes. You learn to feel what they feel. That's what makes people kinder." One of the students asked how he managed to stay so calm after what had happened. He smiled faintly. "Anger burns fast," he said, "but peace lasts longer." His words spread online again, quoted and shared thousands of times. People began to call him a voice of quiet strength, but he didn't think of himself that way. In his eyes, he was just someone who had lived long enough to know that hate only multiplies when you give it power. A few days later, something unexpected happened. The police chief requested to meet him privately. The chief, a serious man with tired eyes, came to his house one afternoon. He removed his hat as he entered, clearly uncomfortable but sincere. "Sir," he said, "I came here to say I'm sorry. What happened shouldn't have happened. We failed you." The old man listened silently. The chief continued, explaining that both officers involved had been suspended pending review. "They need to understand what they did was wrong." "We all do," he said quietly. The man nodded slowly. "I appreciate you coming," he replied. "But I hope this isn't just about me. I hope it changes something." The chief looked down for a moment, then said, "It already has." After the meeting, word spread that the department was not only changing its policies, but also starting a community outreach program in the man's name. They called it the Open Book Project. Its purpose was to bring people together through reading, conversation, and shared understanding. It was a small step, but it meant something. When the man heard about it, he felt a mix of surprise and gratitude. He never wanted his name to be tied to any movement. But if it helped others see one another with more compassion, he was thankful. A week later, the mayor invited him to a public forum where city leaders, police officials, and community members gathered to discuss the incident. The man didn't plan to speak, but when the microphone was offered to him, the crowd began to clap softly, encouraging him. He stood slowly, his posture slightly bent but his voice steady. "I don't have much to say," he began. "I'm just an old man who loves to read. I don't want pity or anger. I only want understanding. The world is full of people who look, think, and live differently. But we're all still people. We all need peace. If my story has reminded anyone of that, then maybe something good can come from it." When he finished, the room fell silent for a moment, then filled with applause. Some people had tears in their eyes. Others stood up, moved by his calmness and humility. It wasn't a speech of anger or accusation. It was one of forgiveness and hope. Over the next few weeks, local schools invited him to visit and read to students. He accepted a few invitations, always carrying his favorite old book. The children listened closely as he read, his voice soft but full of emotion. After each session, they would gather around him, asking questions about life, patience, and how to stay kind even when the world feels unfair. He loved those moments. They reminded him of his younger days when he taught children who believed that kindness could fix anything. One day, after finishing a reading session at a small library, a reporter asked him if he believed justice had been served. He paused before answering. "Justice isn't always about punishment," he said. "Sometimes it's about learning. Sometimes it's about growing. The officers will remember what happened. The city will remember. That's enough for me." That night, he finally returned to the park. It was almost empty, the air cool and quiet. The oak tree stood tall, the same as always. He walked slowly toward the bench, the same one where everything had started. For a moment, he just stood there, unsure if he should sit. Then he placed his hand on the wooden backrest and smiled faintly. He sat down, opened his book, and began to read again. The words came easily, his voice steady and calm. A couple walking their dog passed by and nodded warmly. A young man jogging by recognized him and waved. There was no fear this time, no tension, only peace. As he turned the pages, he thought about how strange life could be. One moment of misunderstanding had turned into a movement. His pain had opened conversations that had been silent for too long. The moonlight fell across the pages of his book. For the first time in weeks, he felt completely at ease. The park no longer felt heavy with memory. It felt alive again, full of voices, lessons, and quiet strength. When he finally closed the book, he looked up at the sky and whispered softly, "Maybe this was meant to happen." He stood, straightened his coat, and began walking home, his steps slow but sure. Behind him, the bench sat empty once more, but not lonely. It had become a part of a story, one that reminded people that even small acts of courage and calm can create change. And as he disappeared down the quiet street, the wind carried the faint echo of his voice, the same voice that once shook the world simply by reading. Weeks had passed since the man returned to the park for the first time after everything that happened. Life was slowly returning to normal, though it wasn't the same kind of normal he once knew. He still took his quiet morning walks, still read his books, and still smiled at the neighbors who passed by. But now people didn't just see him as the old man with the book. They saw him as someone who stood for peace and dignity in the face of unfairness. The park had become a little more lively these days. Families came more often, kids ran around playing, and people from other parts of the city stopped by just to sit on the same bench where the incident had taken place. It had become a quiet symbol of hope, not because of what happened there, but because of what came after. The local library organized a small event one sunny Saturday afternoon. They called it the Reading of Hope. The idea was simple. People of all ages would gather in the park, bring their favorite books, and read together in silence for a few minutes. It was a way to remind everyone that reading, something so simple and peaceful, could bring people together instead of dividing them. When the old man arrived that morning, he was surprised to see how many people were there. The park was filled with laughter, conversation, and the soft sound of pages turning. There were children sitting on picnic blankets with storybooks, parents reading aloud to toddlers, and even police officers helping to hand out water bottles. The atmosphere felt warm and genuine. Someone noticed him walking in and called out, "He's here." A soft round of applause followed, not out of pity but respect. The crowd made space for him to sit on his favorite bench. He looked around, smiling shyly, a little overwhelmed but touched. He held his old book close, the same one that had started it all. When the time came for everyone to read in silence, he opened his book and began to read softly, his voice blending with the gentle rustle of pages around him. It felt peaceful again, just as it used to be. After the event, the mayor approached him to thank him for coming. "You've reminded this city of something important," the mayor said. "That dignity and kindness are stronger than anger." The man nodded, grateful but humble. "I only did what anyone should do," he replied softly. "Sometimes standing still is all you can do." The mayor smiled. "Still, your calmness changed more than you realize." The city later announced that the park bench would have a small plaque placed next to it, not to glorify what happened, but to remind people to treat others with respect. The plaque simply read, "Peace begins when we see one another." That same week, the community center began hosting a new reading program inspired by him. It was open to everyone, children, adults, retirees, and even local officers. People read together, discussed stories, and shared lessons about empathy and understanding. The man attended sometimes, quietly sitting in the back and smiling as others discovered the joy of reading. One afternoon, a young boy approached him after a session. The boy looked nervous at first, but then asked, "Sir, can you teach me how to read like you?" The man chuckled softly. "You already can," he said, "but I can show you how to feel what you read." He began tutoring the boy once a week, meeting him at the park under the same tree. Each time more kids joined, bringing their books. They called it the bench class. They read stories about courage, kindness, and forgiveness. And while the world outside was still full of problems, those small moments of togetherness felt like healing. The man's story continued to reach people far beyond the city. News stations covered updates about how the community had come together. A few even invited him for interviews, but he politely declined most of them. "I'm not looking for attention," he would say. "I'm looking for peace."